Okay, ladies and gentlemen, so our screencast for today is going to focus on the beginning of the civil rights movement, and we're really going to focus on the process of desegregation and kind of like where desegregation begins, what areas of American life is first desegregated, and then we're going to go into how schools are integrated in the mid-1950s into the 1960s. So, first thing we have to kind of take a look at is just, I think, a look at race relations today in the United States. So this is kind of spanning from 1995 up until about 2016. So we're a little bit beyond this at this point. But if you look at this graph, it kind of shows you that how Americans view race relations in the country over the last about 30 years or so has gone up and gone down depending on, I think, a lot of circumstances that are going on in the country at the time. Currently, we're in a situation where more people are viewing race relations as bad than as good. If you went back, let's say 10 years ago, more people were viewing race relations as being good. So you can kind of factor that into maybe a lot of different things that are going on within the country as to why people might be viewing race relations in America the way that they are. Now, comparatively to the way that they were in the 1940s and 1950s and 1960s, our race relations have gotten markedly better. So that's really what we're going to kind of talk about today, how we start to integrate American society and how some of, the segregationist policies are removed out of, the American South and also parts of the American North as well. So what we're going to start with is kind of just a little bit of background to remember. So what institutionalized segregation in the United States was the famous Supreme Court case Plessy versus Ferguson that we talked about, which is occurring in the time period after Reconstruction. And this set the precedent of separate but equal is kind of an acceptable format for delineating society. And the southern states are going to adopt this idea of separate but equal. And if you look here kind of like this picture, you're going to have separate facilities for black and white Americans in everything from like busing to movie theaters to water fountains to bathrooms to public accommodations. Really kind of Southern society was completely segregated throughout the time period from the 1890s up until the 1950s. And Plessy versus Ferguson is the Supreme Court case that institutionalizes this and allows this to be legal throughout the United States. Now, if you remember in this case, it's an 8-1 decision. But there is one dissenting opinion, and that's going to be an important opinion because when they overturn this later with Brown versus the Board of Education, which we'll talk about later in the screencast, those justices that do vote to overturn it are going to kind of go back to that one dissenting opinion that kind of foreshadowed some of the more modern way of thinking about segregation. Okay, so this, as you know, instituted this idea of separate but equal. Now, this concept of separate but equal was really never in place throughout the American South. You had separation, but you didn't really have equality as far as facilities were concerned. And I think that this picture kind of highlights that as far as funding is concerned for different, public accommodations, for schooling. It really was not ever equal in the society, during this time period. Okay, just to remind you guys, we call this the Jim Crow era, or these are the Jim Crow laws. And so Americans start to challenge these laws a little bit starting in the late 1940s and then into the 1950s. There's really going to be a movement to kind of overturn segregation in American society and to integrate, black and white Americans into, full integration into society. So we're going to take a look at like where this kind of began and what areas this began in. So one of the leading areas for integration of Americans is going to be sports. And so you're looking at famous baseball player Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in Major League Baseball in 1947. Now, as far as athletics are concerned, to me it doesn't really surprise me that sports is one of the first areas that you see integration of American society. If you look at sports, the main goal of athletics, especially at the professional level, is to win. If a player can help a team to win, a lot of times a manager or an owner of a team might want that person on their team. And so I think sports was kind of a natural area to have integration kind of begin in because of the competitive nature of it and because teams want to win. And whoever the best players are, they really would like them on their team. And so Jackie Robinson, I think, is a good example of that, of somebody who was just so talented that they were able to, the owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers wanted him on, his part of his organization. Now, when Jackie Robinson gets to the Brooklyn Dodgers, he's not necessarily well received by all of his teammates, and definitely not well received by the fans, and depending on the city that they were going into. So if you look here, this is the photograph of the Brooklyn Dodgers, the team photo in 1947. And if you look here, you have some players on the team, or specifically one, but some other players as well, who did not want Jackie Robinson to be a part of the Brooklyn Dodgers. So if you look here in the back row, this player is kind of like protesting Jackie Robinson being on the team by not looking directly at the camera, and that was kind of his way to protest him being on the team. And there were several players on the team that tried to get like a petition going to have Jackie Robinson removed from the team. The owner of the Brooklyn Dodgers, named Branch Rickey, really kind of would have none of that. He did join the team and had a very successful season kind of in his first year in Major League Baseball. So he's significant for baseball history, but I think much more significant for American history as far as what it represented for America and that first step towards integrating American society publicly. Now, baseball, is a popular sport today, but back in this time period, it was the sport of Americans. You have to kind of understand the popularity of baseball and how important it was to Americans. And to be a baseball player in American society at the time was to be like kind of an icon for your city, an icon for your area that you were from. And so this was a huge deal to kind of, for African Americans, it was a huge deal, and it was a huge step for American society. Now, this is also a famous event that took place. So one of the players on the Brooklyn Dodgers, Pee Wee Reese, was the shortstop. There in a lot of the southern cities, they would really give Jackie Robinson a really horrible time when he was, playing in the games. And so this is a kind of a famous moment where Pee Wee Reese kind of like goes over to Jackie Robinson during a game while like the fans are really like yelling at him and giving him, screaming all kinds of racist, horrible things at him, and kind of puts his arm around him to kind of show like the solidarity that he had with his teammate. And that kind of became like an iconic moment during that first season. And if you go to Citi Field, you have Jackie Robinson's number 42 right outside Citi Field as like a memorial to Jackie Robinson. Now, I always like to mention the second African American player to break into Major League Baseball, named Larry Doby. So he broke in actually in the same year, just later in that same year. So he kind of experienced all the same things that Jackie Robinson experienced, trying to break the color barrier. But I always kind of feel like he's forgotten, and so I always try to mention him because he's also, a fantastic baseball player as well. Okay, now the second area that you're going to see integration happen in American society is going to be in the military. So World War II we still had segregated units during World War II. African Americans fought in World War II, but they fought in separate segregated units. However, the Korean War, which happens in 1950 to 1953, is going to be our first war where we have integrated units fighting, on the American side. And so the person who makes this decision is our commander-in-chief, who is Harry Truman at the time. And really, it's the commander-in-chief's sole decision, dealing with the military. And so Truman decided to integrate the military. And so this is, again, like a next step, another very important institution in America to kind of be integrated. And it's kind of putting America on this path towards a more integrated society. Again, in both of these cases, I think with baseball and with the military, one person was able to make this decision. So in this case, it's the president, Harry Truman. In baseball's case, it was one owner, Branch Rickey, that was able to decide to sign Jackie Robinson. And so they were able to kind of push things forward a bit towards integration. Now, the part of integration that you've probably focused on in the past in your history classes has been probably school integration. And so that famously happens with the Supreme Court case Brown versus the Board of Education. So in this case, a young girl named Linda Brown, she lived in Kansas, and essentially she wanted to go to, or her mother wanted her to go to a school that was really very close to her house, about a mile from her house, but she ended up having to go to a school that was very far away from her. because they had segregated schools at the time. So her mother sued the school system, and there was a number of other black residents of the area who kind of joined in the lawsuit, and they sued the Board of Education, saying that this was a violation of their rights, kind of separating children by race to go to different schools. So famously, this case overturns the decision in Plessy versus Ferguson. So this is a very important landmark Supreme Court case. And what it did was it establishes the idea of separate but equal is inherently unequal. So it overturns that concept that was laid out in Plessy versus Ferguson of separate but equal. And this is done by the Earl Warren Court, Chief Justice Earl Warren. So he's another famous Supreme Court justice that you should know in American history. So we talked about John Marshall kind of early in American history as a famous Supreme Court justice, and the Marshall Court. This is another famous era for the Supreme Court because they established a lot of important precedents in this time period. So what they mean here, separate but equal, is inherently unequal. And their idea here is very similar to what Justice Harlan said in that dissenting opinion in Plessy versus Ferguson, is that once you separate people by race, essentially you're denoting that you think one is superior and one is inferior. Otherwise, why would you be separating them, in the first place? And so this is kind of a huge landmark decision because it overturns this concept that separating people by race in public places, specifically this case in schools, is unconstitutional and not acceptable. And so what this kind of instills is that the idea that the South is now going to have to integrate their school system, and any other place in America that had segregated schools is going to have to integrate their school system. Now, in the decision, what they say is all states should integrate their school system with all deliberate speed. And really what they mean by that is to do it as fast as possible, because there are logistical things involved. You're going to have to merge school systems and merge different schools together. So all the logistical nature to it. But what a lot of southern states, how they kind of interpret this is kind of like what this sign, kind of symbolizes, that they're going to kind of integrate their school system as slow as possible. So we're talking about like into the late 1950s, into the early 1960s, there's still a bunch of southern school systems who have not integrated their school system. And so a famous example of this is 1959, is in Little Rock, Arkansas, which is a high school. There's a high school there called Central High School. And in 1959, they still hadn't integrated their school system. So Brown versus the Board of Education was 1954. And so 5 years later, they still hadn't integrated their school system. And they were going to try and integrate it in 1959 with a select 9 students, 9 black students who were going to go to the white high school to begin the integration process. Now, there was fierce resistance from the community, and on the day that they were supposed to start school, you had all kinds of protesters out there trying to stop them from, entering into the school building and beginning school. And so, famously, what had to happen was President Eisenhower had to bring in the U.S. National Guard in order to essentially protect these students and escort them into the school building on, their days of school. And believe it or not, each student got assigned a National Guardsman who went to class with them and, walked with them in the hallway every single day of school for that entire year. And that's kind of how serious it was as far as their potential or the threat of danger on these individuals just going to school and trying to integrate the school system. And so it's pretty violent and potentially pretty serious. So this became a famous, event in the civil rights movement. And northern cities were not immune to this at all. We had integration in, let's say, for example, in our school, in Francis Lewis High School, with school busing, and there was all kinds of controversy around school busing in New York City, and all kinds of controversy around school busing in Boston. And so, yes, it happened first in the South, but you also had some controversy around this in the North as well. All right, so we're going to stop there. We will have a second screencast about the civil rights movement and kind of continue on with some of the leadership and some of the key legislation that's passed in the civil rights movement.